Boker Tov, and welcome to another Taste of Torah. Our Torah portion for this week is Vayigash, and it is the next installment in the story of our ancestor Joseph in his remarkable saga. So what's happening in our Torah portion? Well, first of all, Joseph is confronting his brothers, and he sees that they have become different people. He sees that they are, in fact, very concerned for his younger brother Benjamin, who seems to be in danger at Joseph's hands. And they also seem to be concerned for one another and their father. And so he does a remarkable thing. He declares himself, he reveals himself to them, and he accepts that they have changed, and he connects himself back again. He says the famous phrase, the most key moment in the entire Torah portion: I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold down into Egypt. But now don't be troubled and don't be vexed because you sold me, for it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. What a remarkably generous interpretation of his experience. Sold into slavery, subject to the whims of other people, thrown into a dungeon, sentenced to death, he nevertheless comes to this improbable position, and he is able to set it aside, saying, this worked out well. How can you say such a thing about such terrible stuff happening? But that's exactly what Joseph does. We could see this as a biblical version of the popular notion of everything happens for a purpose. But I actually think it's a little more complicated than that. It's not that Joseph doesn't think terrible things happened. And it may not even be that Joseph believes that God contrived all of his suffering for a greater purpose, but rather he sees that something good can and has come from it, from the challenges and the disappointments and the heartaches he's endured. He now has an opportunity to do something wonderful. We like to say it's making lemonade out of lemons, all right? And I think there's a subtle difference between that and the belief that everything happens for a purpose. Tragedies are tragedies. The pain is real, the loss is real. But retroactively, our Torah teaches us, cataclysms can be seen as opening doorways to greater fortune. They can be seen as an opportunity for gain that outweighs the tragedy. I was talking online with someone about the American Civil War, and their position was, well, wouldn't it have been better if there had been no Civil War, with all the death and all the suffering and all the destruction of property and impoverishments of states and all these sort of things? And I could say, yes, we could say that. However, the Civil War directly sprang from other evils, the evil of slavery. And while the suffering that Americans endured for the war, that blood is visible, that suffering is manifest. In fact, there were 4 million people who were suffering invisibly for 200 years leading up to this moment. And they were no longer suffering. The kingdom of blood and the empire of rape that was the American slave system was ended. And even if it was traumatic and painful and tragic, it did open a new chapter in American history in which we embraced greater freedom. And we came closer to the ideal of a nation for, of, and by the people. So we see that also in our own tradition. And that is, it starts with Adam and Eve. I mean, again, the impression we're left with is that being expelled from the garden, it certainly looked like a tragedy at the time. And yet, looking back on it, we can say, well, civilization came forth, history began, and it was a series of incremental improvements from there. And who of us wouldn't want to be where we are rather than naked animals in a garden? Hanukkah, which we've just finished, is a tragic story, as many of our holidays begin. Our people were enslaved to an empire. We were subjected to persecution. Our temple was destroyed. We were forced, many of us, to flee our homes because we were resistors. And I'm sure that the suffering was monumental. But we can look back and say something great came out of it. With the rededication of the temple and with decades of effort, the Jews once again became a sovereign people who, with their own kingdom, ruling themselves, and they set an example for us to stand up to tyrants and to fight for what is right. So that's really what our Torah portion has to teach us, to think about, to develop the skill to recast any situation, however awful, and find a greater meaning in it. It's not necessarily that the greater meaning was pre-programmed into it, but rather we can extract it. We are the animals who make meaning. And I think of that specifically in terms of Dr. Viktor Frankl. For those of you who have read his wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl, who was an Austrian psychiatrist and then an inmate at Auschwitz, took from his terrible, miserable experience, and he realized that he learned something about human nature. And the essential meaning was this, that we do better when we find meaning. That's literally his message. He says, look at that. I watched inmates who felt that all the possibilities of their life were past them, that they were doomed, that they were walking dead, and they soon became really dead. On the other hand, he saw a minority of inmates, of prisoners suffering under the Nazis, who were able to say, why I want to live beyond this. There is something I can take from this. And those people, he came to believe, endured and survived. So if we can find meaning in our suffering, whether it was built in there or not, we can do wonderful things. So look at, Joseph sees his brothers. He recognizes their treachery. He understands the ill will involved in what they did. And nevertheless, he finds meaning in his experience. He was meant to be here so that he could save lives. And he does. He saves his entire family. He saves the Egyptian people. It is the Jewish view, it's the Jewish view to say, what can we learn from this? What can we take from this terrible past? This is our situation now. We are preparing to enter 2021 after an awful year. We could be forgiven for looking back on the year past and focusing only on the deaths, on the losses, on the destruction, and on the terrible human discord of people fighting with each other in the midst of a great tragedy. But the Jewish view is different from that. It says, if we find meaning in these terrible experiences, then we can take that to make a better future. That's what Joseph is teaching us, and I hope we're able to take his lesson and take some important points from the misery of the past in order that we might make a better future. Thank you, everyone.